Okay, so just to look at a few questions that might come up on the paper 2 paper. They're all evaluation questions. So first one there at the top, discuss the likely impact of rapid growth of emerging and developing economies on world trade patterns. So kind of trade patterns themselves, we're looking at that kind of intra and inter-regional trade, but also in terms of the volumes. Would be another kind of analysis route here. In terms of impact, you could link this into, on one side, trade surpluses, and on the other side, kind of the negative thing in terms of trade deficits. So the rapid growth of those economies, they will be exporting manufactured goods, to developed countries. You could also link that into greater inter-regional trade because of that. So from the kind of less economically developed to the developed countries, the wider impacts of that may be that you have an increase or a decrease in intra-regional trade in some areas. However, you also have the areas of the world such as Africa and Southeast Asia, which have their own free trade areas. So this would be a good way to evaluate this. It depends upon to what extent they're in a free trade area, because if they're also in a free trade area, it's highly likely that there'll be an increase in intra-regional trade as well. You could also just talk about in terms of the total trade volume. So global trade increases, and also the percentage of trade by less economically developed economies would increase as well. Okay, the question at the bottom, China has specialised in manufacturing, while India has specialised in services. Evaluate the possible benefits of such specialisation to a country or countries of your choice. Well, it gives you two countries there, India and China, and it gives you two products. So what you do have is the analysis of comparative advantages. You would have India on one of the lines, you'd have China on the other, you'd have manufacturing on that axis, and you'd have services on this axis. The easiest way to analyse this is to make them both operate at the same point, so that they are both producing a combination of goods roughly the same. So services of China, services of India, and manufacturing of India. What that means is when you add those two quantities together, you'd end up with manufacturing somewhere up here and services somewhere over here. So you would have this point here, just put that blue because the first one is that point there, which would be the current global production. Once that specialisation occurs, so India specialises in services and China specialises in manufacturing, the total amount produced in that situation is much greater. Now what those both indicate is surpluses to China and India. So India would create a surplus in services, China would create a surplus in manufacturing, and that's above domestic demand. So whatever they demand domestically, what it would allow you to do is either trade the whole of the surplus or trade part of the surplus, so you would be able to domestically consume more of what you produce. So China can consume more manufactured goods, but also China can consume more services because they can then trade with India. So you've got an increase in standard of living because of the consumption part of that as well. You're also going to get an increase in employment or higher wages because the productivity of your economy is also increased. So for the same factors of production, you're producing more, selling more, and there's an earnings part that benefits there as well. You're also more sustainable as an economy because you're using up less resources or you're using the resources you have more efficiently. So in the longer term, the economy is going to be more sustainable. So that's looking at some of the benefits. If you're looking at a cost, it could be that you lose some security of supply. So it might be that because you're now reliant or interdependent upon another economy, that if for whatever reason their supply falls or you end up in a trade dispute with them, you can't consume a good or service. A good example is what's going on in Qatar today. Saudi Arabia has basically cut off the border. 40% of their food comes from Saudi Arabia, so there's going to be 40% less food in the shops in the short term. One of them, it can also be that it reduces utility in terms of choice. So you're then essentially just getting one version of the good or service, whereas consumers like to have multiple goods or services. And what it also doesn't factor into account is things like negative externalities. So is manufacturing, if India focuses on services, they're not going to create pollution, whereas China focusing on manufacturing will probably get some negative effects alongside that as well. The next question here, in 2014, Ethiopia and Uganda decided to join the Common Market for Eastern and South African Economies, COMESAR. You don't need to know that, but the important part here is it says it's a free trade area. As it's mentioning two countries, so they're both going to become part of this group. Just think of it as in there's going to be more countries already in that group. Let's just say, for example, there's 10, and they're going to be the two new members of it. And again, assess the likely economic effects. You're going to have some positive and negative effects, or some different effects because of that. One of the most straightforward ones is you could analyse this in terms of a reduction in tariffs. And the tariff graph so you've got domestic supply and you've got world supply, and world supply plus the tariff. You could just remove that tariff and you'd have the gain in terms of quantity from the lower priced goods and services that you're going to have imported into the country, and a kind of a gain in consumer surplus from that tariff being taken away as well. So you could analyse the benefits of free trade in terms of lower priced imports, but also potentially lower priced exports, so that you get the value of your imports goes down, and as the quantity of your exports increases, the value of those increase. So again, you could link this into a trade surplus. So there's a microeconomic benefit in terms of standard of living, there's a macroeconomic benefit in terms of trade surplus. The negatives that you could have would be that you would reduce trade with. So this is kind of examples of trade creation between, and you could say it might be trade creation between Ethiopia and Uganda, as they would remove tariffs on each other. But you then also get trade diversion, which is that maybe now Ethiopia reduces its trade with, let's say, the UK. So now there is new tariffs that are part of COMESAR to the EU, and potentially the UK may have been more efficient in the past, but now it becomes less efficient, or it becomes higher priced. So actually the price of the imports may go up. So because there's new tariffs on the UK, you swap to Uganda, but there's a loss there. So potentially in the short term, that might make the trade balance worse. Also, kind of on the benefit side, you may link that trade creation into economic growth or employment, or potentially economic development, if you wanted to kind of link it to the Harrod-Doane model, higher incomes. However, you might say that economic growth doesn't guarantee economic development. And you could link that into inequalities. It might only be the industries which trade goods and services that gain the benefits. It may be that it's capital intensive trade that improves, and so on. The question at the bottom: coffee beans account for 28% of Ethiopia's exports and 19% of Uganda's exports. Evaluate the possible economic benefits to Ethiopia and Uganda of the expansion of fair trade schemes for their coffee industries. So fair trade is kind of goes against free trade, and it's quite similar to a minimum price that is paid for a good. What it does allow those countries to do is to achieve a higher price than the market price. And one of the negatives of primary products is that they are kind of low value products, and that those low value products will have deteriorating terms of trade in the longer term. So one of the arguments is that if you agree a higher market price, that allows incomes for farmers to rise. And again, linked to the Harrod-Doane model, may be one way in which you can get development for that country. So increase income, increase saving, increase investment, etc. And try and link that into development. One reason it might not lead to development, or several reasons. One is that it kind of still keeps people within the primary sector. So they still haven't moved away. If you think of the Lewis model, which depends on industrialization, it's keeping people within the economy in farming, and also in something that is low value added anyway. So even though you're getting a bit more than what you would normally, it's still a low value added sector. You could argue that the higher price is paid in developed countries, so it's paid to businesses here, so that maybe not all the benefits of the higher price is passed on. And there's lots of evidence that says that because of the number of people in the supply chain, that not the full extra amount that's paid for fair trade coffee in relation to normal coffee is passed on. A good way to evaluate questions around developments are other policies. So for example, you might link microfinance in and say that would allow a farmer to invest in capital, which would increase productivity, and that might be a better way of developing for that individual. Okay, and lastly, this couple of questions: from 1993 to 2014, public expenditure as a proportion of GDP rose from 35% to 42% in Japan, but fell from over 55% to below 50% in Italy. Discuss the reasons for a possible increase in the level of public expenditure as a proportion of GDP. So it's really looking at kind of the Japanese example there, 35 to 45%. In terms of the discussion part of this, so looking at kind of the reasons why the public expenditure might increase, and possibly evaluating those reasons. So one of the reasons might be discretionary things. So it might be that the government chooses to increase capital or current spending, and that might be to build infrastructure for the long term, or it might be that there is a need for greater healthcare or education, and those things would increase the government spending. It could be linked to something like an aging population, which is one of the main reasons in Japan and again that will just cause the level of current free healthcare or the cost of that to rise. It could be linked into short-term things like a recession, and then analysing that tax receipts would fall and private sector jobs would fall, which would lead to greater government spending on things like benefits. And as the economy shrinks, so as GDP shrinks, if government spending is maintained at the same level, then you would have it as a greater percentage of that total. In terms of evaluation, you could link it in terms of time, so that the kind of ageing population may be something that is going to get more significant in the longer term. You could talk about things like a recession potentially being temporary, so short term, and as the recession goes through the economic cycle, then the government spending would fall. You could say it depends upon the type of market or the type of capitalism that the government decides to follow. So kind of the social democracies of Northern Europe tend to have higher government spending, but that's because their focus is more upon things like reducing inequality. And countries that have a lower government spending, like the US, their focus tends to be on economic growth, wealth and incomes. The last question on here, which is evaluate the likely economic effects of a reduction in the level of public expenditure as a proportion of GDP in Italy or another country of your choice. So this is the kind of second part of that statement, 55% to 50%. What you've got to kind of look at in terms of the effects is the positive and negative effects of austerity. So you could kind of use the example of Greece or the example of Italy, or the example of Canada if you're looking at positive effects. So the kind of the Canadian example of austerity: reduced government spending, increased taxes, but this reduced their deficit. And during that period, well, after that period, the economy started to grow again. When it came to Greece, again, significant reductions in government spending, significant increases in taxes, but during that period, economic growth reduced because aggregate demand reduced, as there was a lot of lost jobs, which increased unemployment, higher unemployment, increased government spending, and reduced taxes. So the opposite happened to what was planned, and that led to a negative effect on the economy. So actually the deficit rose and they added to their national debt. Now the evaluation of this around why Canada achieved cuts to government spending or didn't have such negative effects, part of it was to do with a significant devaluing of their currency. So Greece is the example on this side, has a fixed currency with the EU. It can't devalue its own currency. So the fact they had the euro made theirs less effective, but Canada's currency devalued, and that allowed them to increase exports. They also started their austerity when the economic growth had started picking back up. So they were kind of starting austerity in a recovery phase of the economic cycle, and the amount of austerity they did in terms of the size of it was quite small relative to the economy. However, Greece's was much more significant. It was also determined externally. So Greece's was a lot to do with the EU and the IMF deciding, whereas Canada's was a kind of an internal decision, so they kind of managed it a bit themselves.